what if the Titanic had never sunk? Have you ever thought about that? Let's explore what might have happened together. On May 31, 1911, the Olympic-class luxury passenger ship was completed and fully prepared after 2 years of long efforts. 1 year later, it was ready to set sail across the ocean for the first time. This ship was both the largest and the most magnificent ship in the world. Its name was now Titanic. After the news published in the Daily Herald newspaper, many people wanted to travel on this ship. However, boarding this ship was extremely expensive, even for very wealthy people. In 1912, first-class suite cabins cost $4,350, which corresponds to $133,132 in today's prices. If you wanted to book a second-class suite cabin, it would cost approximately $1,834 in today's prices. For first-class passengers, meals usually consisted of expensive meat dishes such as canapés, oysters, lamb, and duckling. For dessert, there were upper-class options like assorted cheese platters and French pastries. Most of the menus were based on French cuisine, although some British and American options were also available. Passengers wishing to purchase a ticket could do so at the headquarters of the White Star Line Company in London. On Wednesday, April 10, 1912, the long-awaited historic day finally arrived. At 9:30, everyone needed to be present and ready at the port of Southampton. Boarding began first with third-class passengers, followed by second-class passengers, and finally first-class passengers, who started boarding 1 hour before the ship's departure. First-class passengers were welcomed on deck by stewards and escorted to their cabins. The ship was far larger and more magnificent than people had imagined. The journey had now begun. The ship's route began in Southampton, then continued to Cherbourg, and later to the port of Queenstown. After taking on approximately 2,200 passengers and crew members there, the ship set sail fully prepared for the main voyage. It was scheduled to arrive in New York a week later, on April 17. Until April 14, the weather remained quite warm. However, as the ship entered colder regions, it encountered extremely strong waves and powerful winds. The night was both quiet and bitterly cold. While passing through the greater Newfoundland area, warnings were received from other ships about drifting ice. For this reason, the ship did not continue at full speed, and the captain reduced speed as a safety precaution. This allowed the lookouts to spot icebergs along the route in time and alert the captain. As a result, it became clear that the ship would reach New York later than originally planned. At 20 minutes to midnight, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee spotted an iceberg. They immediately alerted the bridge. The first officer quickly assessed the situation, ordered the helmsman to steer around the iceberg, and instructed the crew to shut down the engines at once. Every member of the crew worked together in a desperate effort to avoid disaster. Remaining calm under pressure, the first officer managed to overcome the danger with only a slight shudder. Meanwhile, some passengers were awakened by the vibration and rushed onto the deck in their nightclothes. As the cold air swept across the ship, they stood shivering, anxiously watching the unfolding situation. Tension filled the night as everyone waited in fear, wondering whether the ship would collide with the iceberg. Passengers who moved to the starboard side to get a closer look stared on with anxious eyes. The lookouts held their breath, and a deep silence fell over the ship. Thankfully, just centimeters before impact, the Titanic slowly veered away from the iceberg, and no contact was made. No long gash was torn into the hull, the lower compartments were not flooded, and the ship was saved from sinking. Everyone began to applaud. After the necessary checks were carried out, the captain stated that everything was in order. The passengers were invited back inside, and before returning to their cabins, each person was offered a cup of hot tea. Everyone went inside, let out a deep sigh of relief, and slowly sipped their warm tea. The captain then left the passengers to report the incident and issued warnings, especially advising younger passengers to be cautious. In addition, the captain informed other ships traveling in the North Atlantic Ocean about the iceberg. Among these ships was the Carpathia. Since there was no need to rescue the Titanic, the Carpathia continued on its course as normal. A palpable shift enveloped the ship in the wake of the incident. While a good number of those on board didn't quite understand the gravity of the situation, they sensed something new: the sea's inherent volatility and mercilessness. Among the third-class passengers, the event became a constant subject of discussion. Some interpreted it as a sign from above, while others saw it as confirmation of Titanic's supposed invincibility. The crew, in contrast, took the matter much more seriously. Lookouts were now vigilant, and the engine room staff scrutinized every noise and tremor. On the bridge, the captain and his officers meticulously examined the ship's path and the weather, weighing the dangers anew. Though the journey proceeded as scheduled, Titanic had transformed. No longer merely a floating palace, it was now a subtle warning about the delicate interplay between human endeavor and the ocean's might. On April 17, 1912, the Titanic successfully completed its journey, despite being delayed by 6 hours. Thousands of people flocked to the port of New York to see the world's most luxurious ship. On the day the Titanic docked, the world press once again featured headlines praising the ship's grandeur, comfort, and its reputation as being unsinkable. The White Star Line Company reached the peak of its fame, and the Titanic continued to receive acclaim for years as the most famous passenger ship of the Atlantic Ocean. Because this historic disaster never occurred, major reforms in ship safety would also have been delayed. Neither the requirement for wireless operators to be on duty 24 hours a day nor the rule mandating enough lifeboats for all passengers would have been implemented immediately. One of the greatest disasters in maritime history would have faded away between the lines of history. The passengers of the Titanic would have continued along their own paths of destiny. John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and the Strauss couple would have arrived safely in New York, and the impact they left on the business world would have continued for many years. Perhaps new investments would have been made, or perhaps different balances would have emerged in the political arena. Thomas Andrews, the designer of the Titanic, would have continued to observe the ship's performance and might have taken on much greater roles in the development of maritime technology. The ship itself would have had a long career. When World War I began, it would most likely have been converted into a hospital ship or a troop transport, bearing the burden of war like its sister ship, RMS Olympic. In the 1920s, it would have returned to civilian service, but with the changing winds of the economy, the value of luxury travel would have begun to decline. By the 1930s, the Titanic would have become an aging giant and would eventually have been sent to a shipyard to be dismantled. So, if the Titanic had never sunk, today no one would likely attach such an epic story to it. No films, no books, no legends. It would have taken its place quietly in the dusty pages of history as the greatest ship of its time, and then been forgotten. But one truth remains: the sinking of the Titanic made it immortal. Perhaps that is why, if the ship's fate had not changed on that dark night, we would not be speaking the name Titanic with such excitement today.